So, listen to this. There's a player who can glide past defenders like they're not even there. A player who makes football look simple, almost effortless. A player who at his best feels like pure freedom on the pitch. And yet, every time he puts on a different shirt, that same player looks different. Not worse, not less talented, just restricted, like something invisible is holding him back. And the strange part is, no one really talks about it, because from the outside, everything still looks fine. He's young, he's successful, he's already one of the brightest talents in world football. But if you watch closely, really closely, you start to notice it. The hesitation, the missing spark, the moments where he chooses the safe option instead of the magical one. And that's when the question begins to form. Not about his talent, not about his future, but about something much deeper. What if the problem isn't him, but the environment he's placed in? What if one of football's most natural talents is slowly being shaped into something he was never meant to be? And what if the biggest stage in football is where that conflict finally breaks? At first, this looks like a simple story about a young player still adapting to international football. A talent who just needs more time, more experience, more opportunities to fully shine. But the more you watch, the more that explanation starts to feel incomplete. Because this isn't really about development, and it's not even about form. This is about something much deeper, something that doesn't show up on stats or highlight reels. This is about the difference between freedom and structure, between instinct and control, between a player who thrives in chaos and a system that tries to eliminate it. At Bayern Munich, Musiala is allowed to be unpredictable, to take risks, to lose the ball and try again, to express himself without fear. But at international level, especially in a team still searching for its identity, those same qualities start to look like problems that need to be fixed instead of strengths that should be embraced. And that's where the real story begins. Because this isn't just about Musiala struggling to fit into Germany. It's about Germany struggling to understand what a player like Musiala actually is. And when a system stops understanding its own talent, it doesn't just limit the player, it slowly reshapes him. Not overnight, not obviously, but subtly, quietly, until one day you realize that the freedom that once defined him is no longer there in the same way. And if that continues, the question is no longer how good Musiala can become, but what he might lose along the way. Before any of this tension existed, before the questions, before the subtle changes in his game, Jamal Musiala was simply a player who didn't seem to belong to one place. And maybe that was exactly what made him special. Born in Germany, raised partly in England, shaped by different football cultures, he developed in a way that didn't follow a straight line. At Chelsea's academy, he was surrounded by structure and discipline. But even there were already signs that he saw the game differently, that he played with a kind of natural instinct you can't really teach. Then came the move to Bayern Munich, a decision that at the time felt risky, even confusing to some. But in hindsight, it became the perfect environment for him to grow into himself. Because Bayern didn't just give him minutes, they gave him space. Space to try things, to make mistakes, to drift between lines, to become unpredictable. And that's where Musiala started to feel like more than just a promising talent. He became something rare, a player who could change the rhythm of a game on his own, not through power or speed, but through creativity and intuition. You could see it in the way he carried the ball, the way he moved in tight spaces, the way defenders hesitated because they didn't know what he would do next. It wasn't just effectiveness, it was expression. And for a while, everything made sense. The club, the role, the freedom, it all aligned perfectly with the kind of player he was becoming. But even in those early moments, there was already a quiet question forming in the background. One that didn't seem important yet. What happens when a player built on freedom is placed into a system that doesn't fully trust it? At the time, no one really thought about it because everything was working. But that question never really went away. It was just waiting for the right moment to matter. But then, things started to feel different. Not all at once, not in a way that immediately stood out, but slowly, almost quietly, especially when the context changed. Because playing for a club and playing for a national team are not the same thing. And for Germany, this wasn't just about integrating a young talent. It was happening at a time when the entire system itself was already under pressure. After years of dominance, after 2014, something began to shift. The identity that once defined German football started to blur. Coaches changed, ideas changed, and with every tournament that didn't go as planned, the uncertainty grew. And when a team is uncertain, it doesn't look for chaos, it looks for control. It looks for structure, for reliability, for players who can fit into a system rather than reshape it. And that's where the tension begins, because Musiala is not that kind of player. He doesn't play to maintain structure, he plays to break it. He doesn't follow patterns, he creates new ones in real time. That is exactly what makes him special at Bayern. In a national team still searching for balance, it becomes something harder to manage. You could start to see it in the way he was used, sometimes deeper, sometimes wider, sometimes central, but rarely with a role that fully belonged to him. It wasn't that he was playing badly, far from it, but the clarity wasn't there. The freedom wasn't as natural. The decisions felt slightly delayed, as if he was thinking about the system before trusting his instinct. And that's a small change, but in a player like Musiala, that small change matters more than anything. Because his game isn't built on physical dominance or repetition, it's built on spontaneity. The moment you take that away, even just a little, you don't lose the player entirely, but you lose the version of him that makes the difference. And as Germany continued to struggle, as performances became inconsistent, as expectations started to rise again with every tournament approaching, that pressure didn't just sit on the team, it started to settle on individuals. Especially on the ones who were supposed to be the future. And that's when the situation becomes more complicated. Because now, it's no longer just about fitting into a system, it's about carrying one that isn't fully working. And for a player who thrives in freedom, being placed into that kind of responsibility without the right environment doesn't elevate him. It slowly begins to limit him. And this is where the details start to matter. Because the difference isn't just something you feel, it's something you can actually see if you pay attention to how Musiala plays in different environments. At Bayern Munich, everything around him is designed to amplify what he does best. The structure exists, but it's flexible. It moves with him. It adapts to his decisions instead of restricting them. When he receives the ball between the lines, there's movement ahead of him, options that allow him to take risks, players who understand that unpredictability is part of the plan, not a problem. And because of that, you see the version of Musiala that feels almost impossible to defend. constantly turning, dribbling, accelerating, creating space where there shouldn't be any. His numbers reflect it: goals, assists, progressive carries, but more importantly, the impact is visible beyond the stats. He changes how the game feels when he's involved. But then you shift to the international stage, and the picture becomes less clear. Not worse, just less natural. The same situations exist: receiving between lines, facing defenders, trying to create something out of nothing. But the context around him is different. The movement is more rigid, the spacing isn't always optimized for his style, and the rhythm of the team doesn't always match his instincts. And when that happens, even a small hesitation becomes noticeable. Instead of turning immediately, he might take an extra touch. Instead of driving forward, he might recycle possession. These are small decisions, almost invisible if you're not looking for them, but they accumulate over time. You can think about key matches where Germany needed creativity, moments where the game felt stuck, predictable, controlled, but without real danger. In those moments, players like Musiala are supposed to break the pattern, to introduce something unexpected. And sometimes he still does. Flashes of brilliance, quick turns, sudden dribbles, moments where you remember exactly who he is. But those moments don't come as consistently as they do at club level. Not because the talent disappears, but because the conditions around it are different. Even coaches have hinted at this without saying it directly. There's often talk about balance, about positioning, about discipline, about making the right decision in the context of the system. And those ideas are not wrong. They are necessary for any team to function. But for certain players, especially ones built on instinct, the definition of the right decision is not always the safe one. Sometimes it's the unpredictable one, the risky one, the one that breaks structure instead of maintaining it. And if a player starts to second-guess those instincts, even slightly, the effect is immediate. You also see it in comparisons, not direct ones, but in the types of players Germany historically relied on. Players like Müller, Kroos, Özil in his prime, all creative in their own ways, but within clearly defined roles that the system understood. Musiala is different. He doesn't fit neatly into those categories. He's not purely a playmaker, not purely a winger, not purely a midfielder. He's fluid, and that fluidity is exactly what makes him difficult to place in a system that is still trying to define itself. And when a team is searching for identity, it often defaults to control, because control feels safe. But creativity doesn't grow in safety, it grows in trust. And that's the subtle tension that keeps appearing again and again, in performances, in decisions, in the way the game flows around him. It's not about one bad match or one missed opportunity. It's about a pattern that slowly builds, a version of Musiala that still looks good, still contributes, but doesn't feel as free as he once did. And the more that pattern repeats, the more it starts to feel like something bigger than just form or tactics. It starts to feel like a fundamental mismatch between a player and the environment he's placed in. But here's where the story takes a turn, because up to this point, it's easy to think this is just a young player still adapting, still learning how to fit into international football, still trying to find his place. That's the simple explanation, the comfortable one. That's not actually what's happening. What if Musiala isn't struggling to fit into Germany, But Germany is struggling to understand what kind of player he really is. Because the more you look at it, the more that idea starts to make sense. This isn't a player lacking discipline or awareness or intelligence. If anything, it's the opposite. His decision-making at Bayern, the way he reads space, the timing of his movements, all of it shows a level of understanding far beyond his age. So it's not that he can't play within a system, it's that the system he's placed in doesn't fully recognize the value of what he does best. And that creates a very specific kind of tension, one that doesn't explode dramatically, but instead reshapes things slowly. Because when a system doesn't fully trust a player's instincts, it doesn't say it directly, it adjusts his role, limits his space, asks for safer decisions, encourages control over risk. And over time, the player responds, not consciously, not deliberately, but naturally. He starts choosing the safer pass, he hesitates for a fraction longer, he plays within the lines instead of outside them. And that's where the real shift happens, not in his ability, but in his expression. Because Musiala without freedom is still a very good player, but he's not the player who changes games on his own. And maybe that's the part no one wants to say out loud, because it raises a bigger question, one that goes beyond just one player. If a system can't fully use a talent like Musiala, then what does that say about the system itself? Because this is no longer just about development or form or tactics. It's about identity. And whether Germany, as a footballing system, still knows how to handle a player whose greatest strength is not control, but unpredictability. And when you zoom out, this stops being just a story about one player. Because what's happening to Musiala starts to reflect something much bigger about modern football, and especially about Germany. This is a system that once had a very clear identity, a structure that was not just about tactics, but about philosophy, discipline, control, efficiency. Every player understood their role, every movement had a purpose, and for a long time, that clarity was their greatest strength. But over the years, especially after the peak of 2014, that identity began to shift. Not completely, not instantly, but gradually, as the game itself evolved. Football became faster, more fluid, more dependent on individual creativity in tight spaces, and the teams that adapted best were the ones that found a way to balance structure with freedom. But for Germany, that balance has been harder to find. Because when a system built on control starts to lose its dominance, the natural reaction is not to become more open, it's to try and regain control, to tighten the structure, to reduce risk, to make the game predictable again. And that's where the conflict deepens, because players like Musiala represent the opposite of that instinct. They thrive in moments that can't be fully controlled. They create solutions that don't come from rehearsed patterns. And that kind of unpredictability doesn't always fit neatly into a system that is still trying to stabilize itself. You can see it not just in one position, but across the team. Roles that are not fully defined, responsibilities that shift from game to game. A constant search for balance that never quite settles. And in that kind of environment, creativity becomes something fragile, because it depends on trust, on understanding, on a structure that knows when to step back and let the player decide. Without that, even the most talented individuals start to look less decisive, less expressive. Not because they've lost their ability, but because the context around them doesn't fully support it. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because it suggests that the issue is not about producing talent — Germany still produces elite players — but about integrating it in a way that preserves what makes it special. Because if every system eventually shapes its players to fit its needs, the question is, what happens when those needs are no longer aligned with the kind of talent you have? And in Musiala's case, that question feels more urgent than ever, because he is not just another player, he represents a direction, a different way of playing, a version of football that Germany hasn't fully embraced yet. And this is where everything builds toward, because sooner or later, every unresolved tension in football finds its way onto the biggest stage. Not in training, not in small matches, but in the moments that actually define careers. For Musiala, that stage is not hypothetical. It's coming. And when it arrives, there won't be space for subtle differences or quiet adjustments anymore. Everything becomes clearer under pressure. Every hesitation feels heavier. Every decision carries more weight. And every system is exposed for what it truly is. Because in those moments, talent alone is not enough. It has to connect with the structure around it. It has to be understood, supported, trusted. And that's where the real question begins to matter. What version of Musiala shows up when the pressure is at its highest? Is it the player who drifts past defenders without thinking, who plays with instinct, who changes games in seconds? Or is it the player who pauses, who looks for the safer option, who tries to fit into something that doesn't fully fit him? Because the difference between those two versions is not small. It's everything. One can decide a tournament, the other can disappear inside it. And for Germany, this isn't just about one player performing well or not. It's about whether they can unlock the one element they've been missing, that unpredictability, that moment of chaos that breaks structure when structure isn't enough. If that element is still being controlled instead of trusted, then the outcome doesn't change, no matter how much talent is on the pitch. And that's what makes this moment feel so important, because it's not just a test of Musiala, it's a test of the system around him. A test of whether Germany is ready to evolve, or whether it will continue to shape its players into something safer, something more predictable, something that no longer reflects the full potential of what they actually have. And if that tension isn't resolved, then even on the biggest stage, even with one of the most gifted players in the world, something will still feel missing. And maybe that's the part that makes this story so difficult to define, because from the outside, nothing is obviously wrong. Musiala is still young, still improving, still one of the most exciting players in the world. His future is still full of possibilities, still open, still bright. But not every problem in football shows itself clearly. Some of them exist in the space between what a player is and what he's asked to become. And that space is where things slowly change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, until one day the player you're watching is not quite the same as the one you remember. Not worse, not broken, just different. And maybe that's the real question that stays after everything else. Not whether Musiala will succeed or fail, but what version of him will exist when it all unfolds. Because talent like his doesn't just disappear, it adapts, it survives, it finds a way. But in doing so, it can also lose something along the way, something that made it special in the first place. And if that happens, it won't be because he wasn't good enough, or because he couldn't handle the pressure. it will be because the environment around him never fully understood what it had. And maybe that's the uncomfortable truth at the centre of all this, that sometimes in football, it's not the player who fails the system, it's the system that fails the player. And if that's the case here, then the story of Musiala isn't just about what he becomes, it's about what football allows him to remain.